Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this 9th Joan Muysken lecture. My name is Bart Golsteen. I'm head of the MILE department, Macro, International and Labor Economics department. And in this role, I will explain what the Joan Muysken lecture is, and I will introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Eeckhout. But before I start, let me extend special thanks to Studium Generale and its representative Jaap Jansen. Studium Generale is the highly appreciated co-organizer of this annual lecture. And also thanks go out to our secretariat, without whom we would have not made this. I think this lecture would have been difficult to organize. The aim of this yearly event is to honor the work of Joan Muysken. Joan played a key role in setting up our School of Business and Economics. He was the first professor of economics at our school and the founding father of the Department of Economics, and he served as a dean of our school. In his research, Joan combines deep theoretical insights with applied research. He has a keen eye for the resulting policy implications and a strong preference for non-orthodox, non-mainstream economic thinking. This annual lecture was initiated as a tribute to him at the occasion of his retirement. I am very pleased to see you in our midst tonight. He is sitting here on the front row. This 9th Joan Muysken lecture will be delivered by Professor Eeckhout. He is currently a research professor at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. He is president of the European Economic Association and member of the Executive Committee of the Econometric Society. Additionally, Professor Eeckhout is an associate editor of the Journal of Economic Theory and the Review of Economic Dynamics. Formerly, he was also an editor of the International Economic Review and an associate editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association. Before going to Pompeu Fabra, he received his PhD from LSE in 1998, I should say, and held previous appointments at other top universities, among which Princeton University, University College London, the University of Pennsylvania, and LSE, London School of Economics. Professor Eeckhout has won a large number of prestigious grants, among which an ERC Advanced Grant in 2020. His publication list is highly impressive, with a large number of articles, among which multiple publications in all so-called top 5 journals in economics, and in many other very highly ranked journals. It's a bit difficult to summarize his work, so I will not do that. But one core element is market power, and today he will explain to us how this is related to the profit paradox, which is also the topic of his latest book. The lecture will take approximately 15 minutes, and after that there is an opportunity for questions. So, Professor Eeckhout, without further ado, we're very proud to have you here in Maastricht and look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction and the kind words. It's a great honor to give this lecture. I had the privilege and pleasure to talk to Joan and have dinner with him and other colleagues, and it's made the stakes even higher. So I'll try to do my best to be up to the level. So I want to talk about the profit paradox, which is the title of the book that I wrote, and what I'm going to try to do is during this lecture basically give you the argument of the book. The book was written a couple of years ago, and you'll see that there's also new things that I'm going to be talking about. So to give you an idea of what I really think of when I think about the profit paradox, I want to tell you an experience I had a few years ago. I met a friend of mine, Alex. This was back in the US. And we hadn't seen each other for a while. We met in a bar, and he was telling me after, we greeted and said how things were. He tells me I'm, closing my business. He had a startup business, he says, in Silicon Valley, and he says, it didn't work. He's going to move back to Europe. He's a European. And as we're kind of talking about what exactly happened as he explains to me what the issue was with his startup business. We're in an American bar with a lot of screens, and on the screen, it was an afternoon, CNN comes up with the news that the Dow Jones had reached 30,000. Today, the Dow Jones is around 42,000, but this was 4 or 5 years ago. And as we see the news, and the news anchors talks about the fact that this is great for the economy, that the economy is extremely healthy. As we talk about this, or as we hear this, Alex tells me, he kind of shakes his head and he says, not for me, not for my business failed. And it's not just me. I've been for nearly 20 years in Silicon Valley, and I've seen a change in what has happened to startup firms. That there was fewer of them, that more of them had difficulties being successful. So it was not just me, it was many more of them. And as we're talking, the person who brings us the beers had overheard our conversation and says, look, not for me either. This whole thing about, the economy being healthy, I've been working in this bar for 13 years, and the wage I take home today is exactly the same wage that I took home back 13 years ago. So we see these two people who, on the one hand, kind of don't feel the same excitement about the economy as the CNN anchor tells us that the Dow Jones or the stock market supposedly is conveying. And this is what the profit paradox is about, on the one hand, these profitable firms who do extremely well, and on the other hand, we see, let's call it symptoms in the economy that are not as good and not as healthy as the ones that we're supposed to believe from the stock market. And the issue that I'm going to be focusing on is that the reason why there's this paradox, why there's this tension, why there's this dichotomy between the stock market and the profits of some of these firms and these consequences for the rest of the economy has to do with the fact that there is too little competition. That some of these firms that are so successful, that are so profitable, are profitable because they are basically some form of a monopoly. Maybe a duopoly or an oligopoly, but they have too little competition that they face from other firms. And this then explains, on the one hand, the positive thing for these firms, which is this high profitability, but on the other hand, it also explains these negative effects and this opposite view in the rest of the economy. And this is basically what I'm going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes. So let me start with the Dow Jones. This is the Dow Jones, not as you know it, because if you go to, say, Wikipedia or Yahoo Finance, you're going to see a very different Dow Jones. But this is the Dow Jones adjusted for inflation, which I think is the right thing to do, because, part of what we see in terms of changing valuations for firms has to do with inflation, and we really want to think about the real change. And if you look at this, you see that since 1945, we have a kind of inverted U-shaped pattern of the Dow Jones. And that means that if you invested $1 in 1945, in 1980, you still had $1. That means that your real return, adjusted for inflation, was basically zero. So this would mean that you invest and you don't get anything more out of it. Instead, if you had invested $1 in 1980, by today, you would have had a return of around 6 to 7% per year. That means that that $1 from 1980 today would be something like $12 or $13 today. Okay, that's the magic of compounding. If you grow at 6 or 7% per year, that becomes very big very quickly. There's something very different before 1980 and after 1980. Now, economy-wide, we see this in the stock market, okay? So we see this perennial growth before less than 1%, after that 7%, but we see it in other measures. One measure that I want to really think about when I think about market power is not just the stock market valuation. I also want to think of what I'm going to call markups, which is the price to cost ratio. If I want to, sell this pointer, there's labor that goes in it, there's materials that go in it, there's plastic that goes in it, there's a chip that goes in it, okay, and that has a certain cost. And then I can buy it at a price that's typically higher than this cost, because if it was lower, they would make losses. And the price cost margin, we call that the markup. Okay, and these markups have gone from 1.2, 20% over cost, to 1.6, 60% over cost over that same period between 1980 and today. Okay, and that's not just true for markups, it's also true for profit rates. What's the difference between profit rates and markups? Well, in markups, I only take into account the real cost of producing this. With profits, I also take into account things like R&D, upfront investments, maybe advertising and marketing. Okay, so kind of fixed costs, as we call them, that are also included. And we see that profit rates have gone up from around 1% to 8%. Okay, there's been a sharp increase between 1980 and today. And so all of these are different indicators that tell us that there is basically an increase in this profitability, markups, stock market valuation, okay, of firms, but it's not all firms. It's only a small fraction of the firms. Okay, it's basically a few dominant firms that have been so successful. Okay, and really what matters here is the distribution. It's not all firms, it's, you know, a few firms in the right tail of the distribution that have been extremely successful. So this is what I said were the markups. It looks remarkably similar to the Dow Jones. Inverted U until 1980, and then from 1980 it starts to increase. Remember, what's the markup? The price to cost ratio. How much you sell a good for and how much it costs you to produce. And it went from around 1.2, so 20% above cost in 1980, to around 1.6, just under 1.6 today. Okay, and so that's a huge change in the sense that you can sell this for a much higher price. I want to apologize. I have a bit of a cold and I have some annoying cough, so I would like to ask for your patience with that. Okay. As I said, it's all about the distribution. If you look at the distribution in 1980, which is the dashed line, okay, so what is the distribution? It's basically telling us, you know, how many of the firms have a markup of 1, okay, and then I see basically this, what this density says is how many there are. There's going to be much fewer firms that have a markup of 3. But the point I want you to take away from this graph is that if I look at 1980, it was all much more concentrated in the middle. And when I look at the 2020 distribution, there's what we call a fatter tail on the outside, okay, towards high markups. So that tells us that all the action is coming from the tails of the distribution. A different way to look at this is if you look at what we call the percentiles. It's really another way of saying the same thing. When I say the 90th percentile, it's that tail from that distribution that I had here towards a 3, something like that. Okay, that's the 90th percentile. I have basically 90% of the firms below 3 or 2.5, whatever the 90th percentile is. And what we see is that this 90th percentile is the one that's been increasing so much. This tells us that the rise in these markups is coming from the very top firms, from a very small number of dominant firms. It's not all firms. When we say markups are increasing, average markups are increasing, it's driven by a very small fraction of firms. In fact, if you look carefully, the bottom line is the 50th percentile. That says half the firms have markups below that. That one is flat. So the markup of the median firm is not changing. The average is increasing because there's a change in the top of the distribution. And that's really what market power is about. It's about a small number of firms that are dominant, and these dominant firms are basically, you know, driving up the average markup, but it's only them who get these higher markups because all the other firms don't get that change. So if you now ask where is this happening, the first thing you'd say is this is in tech. One of the big surprises when we started to work on this with several co-authors is that we realized, or we found out, that it's true in all sectors. It's true in tech, but it's also true in textiles. It's also true in retail, which are not very modern sectors. I mean, textiles has been around for quite a few centuries. Retail has been around for a long time. And so all these kind of increases in these markups, okay, and at the top of the distribution of these markups happens in all sectors. Okay, it's not one particular sector that explains what's going on. It's true everywhere. Now, if we ask, does tech play a role? There's an interesting paper by Teulings and Van Klooster who say, but hold on, even if it's in textiles, it's those firms that invest most in tech that manage to get the high markups. So tech plays a role, but it plays a role in all sectors. So it's not just Google and Facebook, it's also a firm like Inditex, for example, which is the Spanish firm that is the owner of brands like Zara, which extensively uses tech, AI, they try to figure out the logistics in an efficient way, they produce in a highly technological way, they try to understand the preferences of their customers in ways that uses experimentation. These firms have become technically and technologically very sophisticated, but they are operating in a very traditional sector. You might say this is something about the United States, and the data I showed you so far were from the United States, but it turns out that this is a global phenomenon. Here on the top left panel, you see basically the evolution of these markups for the world economy. Remember, for the United States, what I showed you before, it went from 1.2 to 1.6. It looks remarkably similar. If we decompose it in Europe, North America, and Asia, we see similar patterns, maybe a little bit less pronounced in Asia, but North America, which now also includes not only the United States, but Canada and Mexico, we see in fact this even steeper increase, and Europe is very similar. There's been a lot of debate about people saying, yes, this is America, this is tech in America, not what we see in these data. It's true everywhere. Okay, now, part of what I mentioned is the profit paradox is not only documenting what's happening, what is going on with these dominant firms, but we also want to see what the consequences are. And in particular, we want to focus on the macroeconomic implications. Okay? Because if you have market power that happens in the entire economy, as I said, it's true in all sectors, then you would expect that this is going to have economy-wide implications. And why is that? Because if I see that the top firms or the dominant firms in each of these sectors are going to have more monopoly power, higher markups, higher profits, then this is going to have implications for the rest of the economy, because, you know, it's maybe a small number of firms, only the 90th or the top 10 percentile of the distribution, but these firms are big. And they're going to have a huge impact on the rest of the economy. Just to give you an idea how small the number of firms is, worldwide we estimate there's around 400, maybe 500 of these firms that are dominant firms. In the United States alone, there's 6 million firms. Our estimate for the number of firms in the world is 100 million. So if I have 500 firms out of 100 million firms in the global economy, that's a small number of firms. But of course, these firms account for 30 to 40% of GDP in the world. So they are big in economic value, small in the number of firms that there are. And because they're big in the economic value, we're going to see big implications for the rest of the economy. And so I'm going to, in the next few slides, I'm going to focus on 3 categories of economy-wide impacts that we see. One is something that has to do with what I'm going to call the declining labor share. I'm going to explain what that is. Second, what has to do with declining business dynamism. And third, what has to do with rising wage inequality. So let me focus on each of these 3 categories and talk about what are the consequences that we see that are the result of this rising market power that's economy-wide. This is the labor share. What is the labor share? If you look at GDP, the total sum of what's being produced in the economy, some of that is going to be kind of paid out in labor, and some of that is going to be in terms of what is the cost of labor, and some of it is going to be what the cost of capital is. Okay. There's also profits. So we have basically 3 components of what GDP consists of. Now, if we go back to the beginning of the century or the 20s, between Arthur Bowley, who was a British economist, and I'm blanking on the name, it's going to come in a second, people had figured out that the labor share, the share of GDP that's going to compensation for labor, had been remarkably constant. This is one of what we call the stylized facts in the macroeconomy, which is telling us that basically roughly around 2/3, okay, of the GDP was compensation for labor. And that had been true since it was first written down by Bowley, and the other one was Nicholas Kaldor, who was also an economist in Cambridge, but of Hungarian origin. And Kaldor had made a list of, in fact, 6 stylized facts, but this one was one that both between him and Bowley, they said, this is remarkably constant, this share. except until we got to the 1970s, 80s, where this share went from just under 2/3 to, well, 59%. And that's a big change, because you might think, well, what is it to go from 65% to 59%? But the question is, where is it going to? Because we have the labor share, we have the capital share. I'm not going to show you a graph for the capital share, but that's declined as well. The only thing that can have gone up is the profit share. And that's the reason why the labor share has declined. So that's one first macroeconomic implication, that we see that the compensation for labor has declined. A second implication is that when we talk about the labor market, it's not just the total compensation for labor, it's also the wage relative to productivity. This graph tells us basically the story of what's going on in terms of the productivity in an economy since the Second World War, for the US economy, and what happens to wages at the same time. I have to tell you here, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, these are the wages of production and service workers. This is 85% of the economy. These are all the people who are basically not managers. Okay, and what we see is that productivity and wages are kind of moving hand in hand until the 1980s, and from 1980 onwards, wages have stagnated, while productivity has continued to grow. Of course, productivity has continued to grow. There was a little bit of a debate about a slowdown in productivity in the last few years, but we know that the economy has made a huge transformation in terms of technology, and that there's been enormous changes going on. But what is less well known is that the wages of the production and service workers have stagnated since 1980. So we see an enormous gap between productivity and wages that started also in 1980. Now, in addition to the labor share, to the wages, because the labor share, what is it? It's the wage times the number of people, right? That's the labor share divided by GDP. We've seen stagnating wages relative to output, so basically wages relative to output or to productivity have declined. But at the same time, we also see that fewer people work. This is the number of people who are inactive. This is the males, and we see that inactivity has gone from around 3% to 12%. Fewer people work. Well, this is basic economic reasoning, because if wages go down, well, there's going to be more people who say it's not worth it to work. Imagine, someone, the spouse has a well-paid, successful job, and then you have 2 or 3 kids at home. You can say, well, I can work at a wage that's very low, but then I have to pay for daycare, and it's not worth it. So I'd rather stay at home. So labor force participation is down, shown here by inactivity being up. Okay, that was the effect, the macroeconomic effect on the labor market. But it's not just the labor market, it's also the kind of the what we call business dynamism, the activity of firms. Here's a statistic that we call the job reallocation rate. And what is the job reallocation rate? It's basically telling us what percentage of jobs that a firm has are being changed, either because you fire a worker, because a worker leaves, or because you hire a worker or promote a worker. Okay. And so what we see is that around 1980, about 35% of all the jobs were turned over in these ways that I mentioned: firing, hiring, promotion. That has gone down to around 25% in recent years. And so you see that this is a substantial decline in the reallocation rate. And this is basically telling us something about dynamism in the economy. It tells us that firms are in a less dynamic way adjusting to changes in demand, changes in shocks, changes in prices, globalization. Okay, that's declined. And that tells us basically that there's a kind of a weakening of this dynamic aspect of the firms. A second aspect of dynamism is what we call basically the startup rate. If you think about the startup rate, it's really what fraction of firms are basically new firms, are startups. That could be tech firms, but it could also be a restaurant, it could be a little corner shop, it's all firms. Now, until or in the beginning of the 1980s, the startup rate was just under 14%. In recent years, it's about 8%. That's nearly half. Why is that important? First of all, you probably don't believe it. I was telling over dinner that if I tell this story at a cocktail party with a glass of cava or champagne in my hand, people say, oh, this is not true. I mean, we live in a time of technological change. There's new startups everywhere. Google, Facebook, you name it, they're all new startups. That's not what the data says. The data tells us that really the number of startups is declining. The story of my friend Alex is not a story of him personally, nor is it a story of just Silicon Valley. It's a story of the economy as a whole. And it's important that startups are there. Why? Because startups are young firms, of course. And what do young firms do? They tend to hire more people, they tend to hire younger people, and they tend to innovate more. So if you have an economy where there's fewer startups, what that tells us is that we basically have, again, a decline in this dynamism of the economy, because there's less entry of new ideas, and new ideas means less innovation and less hiring. The third set of macroeconomic implications has to do with inequality. So I said first one is about wages, and notice that I said there's wage stagnation. This is the story of our waiter who basically saw stagnating wages. The second, and the labor share, the second set of consequences had to do with business dynamism, how active and dynamic these firms are, which includes the decline in the startup rate, the story of my friend Alex. And third has to do with inequality. The third set of facts have to do with inequality, and here I want to show you, if you want something similar to the wage pattern that I showed you in with the productivity and wage, and here it's going to be kind of split by level of education of each of the groups. So I'm going to have four classes of education. We're going to start with basically at the bottom those who have gone to high school or are dropouts. That's the yellow line. The green line is people who have some college, typically 2 years of college, who have maybe a technical degree. Then those in blue are the ones with 4 years of college, and then in red is those who've done more than a college, a master, a PhD, who may be a doctor, and things like that. And what I want you to take away from this picture is two things. One is that this evolution until the 1980s, this is normalized to 1, so basically we just look at the change. Until 1980 is that everything seems to move quite together. But from 1980 onwards, what we see is that there's a complete fanning out of these patterns. And one of the important things is that if you have a high school degree or you're a dropout, in fact, from 1980, your wage starts to decline. So you're earning less in after 1980 than you were earning before. Okay. Now let's go to economic theory and ask, what does economic theory say? Economic theory says that your wage is equal to your marginal product. How much you produce is reflected in your wage. Okay? That's true if your market is competitive. So basically, if I see wages go up, that means that your productivity has gone up. You're producing more and you get compensated for that. It's important here that this is in a competitive market because, you know, there is someone competing for your labor, and if there's competition for your labor, that's going to be reflected in the fact that they have to pay you whatever you're worth. If you see wages decline, like is the case for high school students and dropouts, then that means that they've become less productive. This would be the case if the market was competitive. I think this is hard to believe because it's true that technological change, in particular digital technology, has had an impact on highly skilled or more schooled workers that's bigger than it is for the less skilled workers. But it's hard to believe that it didn't have any impact on the least skilled workers. Okay, think about a truck driver would be someone with high school or a dropout. They have become more productive in the sense that the truck driver now with the technology is able to have much more efficient going out full and coming back full, because, you know, at times when they didn't have the technology to do the logistics, you sometimes went out full and came back empty. with monitoring devices and GPS, it's much better to control the efficient distribution of time of these workers. So technology has had a positive impact even on the lowest educated workers as well. Even if the impact on the highest educated workers is much bigger, it's hard to believe that the productivity of these high school workers has gone down. But there could be another reason why this wage of these high school workers has gone down. And it could be that, well, market power has gone up. The wedge between their wage and their productivity has increased. And so this is saying their wage doesn't decline because their productivity has gone down. Their wage is declining because of what they produce, of the pie that they generate. They get a smaller share, a smaller slice. And that's the reason why we tend to see that these high school dropouts tend to see a decline in their wages. This is something that people have documented, that the lowest schooled workers say, you know, we earn less than our parents or even our grandparents were making in real terms. We see that there's progress, we see that there's technological advance, but we don't get to share that in the output, or in the wages, sorry. So the important thing here is that we see a fanning out of these wages. We see an increase in these inequality depending on the level of schooling that you have. Now, this is basically repeating what I said earlier. There is an issue that I want to distinguish between the effect of monopoly. What is monopoly? Well, it's a dominant position of a firm in the output market. When you sell this at a given price, this is the good that you have monopoly power over if you have a dominant position. But I can also have what we call monopsony, which is exactly the same thing, but in the input market or the labor market. So rather than me being the only firm that sells this good, I'm the only firm that hires workers. So think of, say, an isolated mining town where the people from the town, the only thing they can work for is the only one firm that's there, which is the mining company. And that mining company doesn't have to pay competitive wages because there's no one else to compete for these workers. So let's distinguish between what that has for an impact on wages. Monopoly on the one hand, so market power in the output market, versus monopsony, market power in the labor market for hiring these workers. When we decompose those, we see that monopsony accounts for about 25%. Because what is the effect of monopsony? Well, you're a big firm, you don't have to pay higher wages, so basically it's a direct effect on the wage. If you have monopoly power, why does that affect the wages? Well, I said this is an economy-wide effect. This is what we call an equilibrium effect. It's a macroeconomic price effect that's indirect. How does it work? It works as follows. If firms have more market power, they charge higher prices. If you charge higher prices, you sell fewer units because demand is downward sloping. So basically, you can afford to charge higher prices because you have a monopoly position. So basically you raise the prices. That means fewer units are bought. If fewer units are bought, fewer units need to be produced. And if fewer units are produced, well, you need less labor to produce it, so the demand for labor goes down. And if the demand for labor goes down, we see wages fall. So monopsony is a direct effect. Monopoly has an indirect effect through the demand for labor, and both of them lead to a decline in the wages. What we find is that 25% of the wages can be explained by monopsony, 75% can be explained by monopoly through this indirect effect on labor demand. Okay. There's another thing that we can look at, which is wage inequality for the top workers. The reason why I want to focus on this is because, as you may have read in the news, inequality is mainly driven by the really very rich. And the rich here, I don't mean so much in terms of the wealth they have, but in terms of the earnings. And so I want to focus on what I'm going to call superstar pay. Superstar pay being basically the pay for those who are the top workers, and in this case I'm going to focus on CEOs. So what we see here is that the red line is an index of the pay that these CEOs get. So these are the top managers in the economy. And what we see is that until the 1980s, that pay, again in real terms adjusted for inflation, is fairly constant. And from 1980, the pay has started to increase substantially. I've superimposed on that the blue line, which is again the markups that from the 50s were again fairly constant, and from 1980 started to increase again. This is telling us that there's a relationship between markups or market power, the monopoly position of the firms, and the pay of these top managers. Notice that here it goes in the opposite direction. I was saying market power was leading to wage stagnation of the production and service workers. Here, market power leads to higher wages of the managers. Okay, so it's kind of again telling us something about this increase in this inequality. And let me kind of focus or zoom in a little bit further on the decomposition that we make here. So this is the research that kind of analyzes where is the origin of manager pay coming from. So if you see the red line here in the left panel, we have data from 1994 to 2019. What you see is that manager pay has roughly doubled in real terms. From the average manager gets around 3 million a year, so these are very high salaries, to around 6.2 million. But we can do a decomposition and say where this is coming from. I'm going to call one effect the firm size effect. Why the firm size effect? Because if you work for a more productive and therefore larger firm, you make everything better in terms of productivity. So that manager is making the productivity of the firm better. And that's the green line. The blue line is basically how much of your compensation comes from the fact that you generate more market power, that you're able to make your firm more monopolistic. Now, the blue line and the green line, they add up to the red line. Okay, that's the way this exercise is constructed. And what you see is that in 1994, the firm size effect, that good effect in terms of making the firm more productive, was the majority, and the market power effect was smaller. And you can see, in fact, on the right panel, it's just a percentage decomposition. So if it says there 40% in 94, well, the blue line was 40% of the red line, the green line was 60% of the red line. Okay, but what we see is that over time, this average goes from 40% to just under 50%. So market power is becoming more important in explaining, why these salaries are so high. But this is just a very small part of the story. The big part of the story is the following. Look at exactly the same kind of decomposition that I want to make here, but now I'm going to take 1 year, 2019, and instead of looking at the change over time, I'm going to look at what happens for the lowest ranked or least productive managers to the highest ranked or most productive managers. So on the horizontal axis, it basically says, are you the lowest paid manager or are you the highest paid manager? So the red line is, again, as before, is the total compensation for the manager, and it goes from, it says there 4 in millions, it says just 0 in millions is 400,000, it's 0.4, and then it goes up to 20 million. In fact, I cut off the graph because it goes up to 80 million. In 2019, the highest paid manager is Tim Cook from Apple, and he gets paid 80 million. Okay, so I just cut it off there. But we can do exactly the same decomposition again. This decomposition with this green line says how much of this manager's pay is due to the fact that this manager is making this firm more efficient. Okay, and the blue line is telling us how much of this manager's pay is coming from the fact that she is making the firm more monopolistic. Okay. By the way, why would firms pay a manager to make the firm more monopolistic? Because the shareholders say, I care about profits. And the way I want to incentivize you as a manager to make profits is by basically, I'm going to give you a share of the profits, and therefore, stock options. And therefore, you're going to work as a manager to do what makes most profits. And if you can make most profits by making the firm more monopolistic, that's what you're going to do. And this is reflected basically in the blue line. And again, as before, the sum of the blue line vertically and the green line is the red line. So we get basically a decomposition in percentages, and that's what's going on in the right panel. And here's the shocker. If we look at the lowest paid manager, the lowest paid manager's compensation, is coming all from making the firms more efficient. This firm size effect. Nothing from market power. However, if I look at the top firms, about 20% is making the manager is making the firm more efficient, this firm size effect. But 80% is coming from the fact that this manager is creating more market power for this firm. So the 80 million compensation that Tim Cook receives, 64 million is for the fact that Apple is a monopolistic firm. Or the fact that you or someone in your household downloads a game and has to pay 30% to Apple, even though they don't contribute any value to it, but they have basically monopoly power. Why? Because they can restrict access to the App Store, because there's no competition between firms who can come on this platform, which is your phone. And so Tim Cook and the people around him have been very smart in restricting access and competition on your phone. That means that they can charge you 30%, and that 30% shows up in the profits of Apple. And then the shareholder says, Tim Cook, you're a great guy, you made a lot of money for us, we pay you 80 million. And we show that around 80% of his compensation comes from the fact that he creates and generates market power for the firm. I put this picture up because this is kind of a metaphor that Warren Buffett, arguably the most successful investor in history, has used to talk about why he chooses the firms that he chooses to invest in. So Warren Buffett gave a talk to MBA students in Florida in the early 2000s. And one of the students says, okay, so what's your success? How do you choose a firm that you invest in? And he says, I choose a firm to invest in. I think of that as a castle. The firm is a castle. It has to be strong, it has to have strong walls, it has to be valuable as a building. And then I want there to be a duke or a duchess who knows the castle, who knows how to take care of the castle, who understands how it works. But above all, I want that duke or that duchess to build an enormous moat around it, which is basically the water that's around this castle, because I don't want anyone to be able to get near to that castle. And I have one message, he says, for these duke and duchesses of these castles. They have to keep extending the moat all the time. And since he was in Florida, he said maybe you should even throw some sharks and alligators in it to deter people from entering. What's the notion, what's the idea of a moat? Well, the notion of a moat is nothing more than saying I want to keep competition away. If you want to go online and you look at the portfolio of Warren Buffett, they're all monopolistic companies. Firms with high markups, firms with very high profit rates. Of course, because that's why he became so successful. He understood that as an investor, to be successful, you have to pick firms that have dominant position, that are monopolistic. Okay. And so this is the idea that where this dominant position is coming from the fact that, well, you basically can kind of keep out the competitors. You can keep out other firms that would like to make the profits that you are making, but they can't. And how does that work? Why is it that these firms that ideally would like to make as much profits as you do, I mean, I would like to make the profits for my firm that Apple does, why can I not do it? And the answer lies in the fact that, let me go back for a second. The answer lies in the fact that if you think about what stops firms from entering, is that you have to have what we call a little bit of a natural monopoly position. What creates a natural monopoly position? Well, we can think of really something that's kind of stopping firms from entering is a barrier to enter, and that can be what we call technological difficulties. This is coming back to the fact that 1980 is a critical year. Why 1980? Why is it that everything changed in 1980? What's so special about 1980? Well, 1980 is a year where digital technology really started to have a takeoff, when digital technology started to have an effect on the economy. Digital technology existed before. I mean, it existed in the 40s. And companies like Microsoft and Apple were founded in the late 70s. But 1980 is really the year where households and firms started to use technology at an extensive scale. How did they do it? Well, they were basically starting to have computers at home. Firms were starting to use computers, but also servers and networks. And this was 1980, but then it went on to the 90s when the World Wide Web became very important. In the 2000s, it was mobile phones. 2010s, it was big data. I guess now we're in the AI phase. So there was a number of changes through the decades, the last four and a half decades, that basically kind of implied an enormous technological change. And technology is something that's in the movie of the economy is both the hero and the villain. It's the hero because technology changes our lives. I mean, if you think about it, even only 15 or 20 years ago, our lives were very different. We didn't have a cell phone. If I don't know, where I'm going, how I take my phone, I just type in where I want to go. 20 years ago, you told anyone, you said, you have a device in your hand and it tells you not only where you are, it tells you where you're going. I mean, it's, you can't believe it. You couldn't believe it then. Now it's the most normal, natural thing. Okay, this has made our lives so much easier, so much more valuable. It has also improved a lot of things. If you think about cancer research that's using technology, what kind of a difference this has made to our lives. Loved ones who survive today who wouldn't have survived 20, 30 years ago. Part of this is, well, digital technology too, because, we can process information now the way we couldn't process that long time ago. So technology and digital technology in this particular case is definitely the hero of the movie that's the economy. But digital technology is also the villain. It's the bad guy. Why? Because the firms that have access to this digital technology, the firms that are the ones who are the first in the market, also use that technology to build moats. They use that technology to keep competitors out. They use that technology to a large extent to build monopoly power. And why is it possible? It's possible because this digital technology has a feature that is very prone to being monopolistic. What is that? It's the type of technology that needs a lot of upfront investment and then has a very low cost of production. We call it the marginal cost is low. Now that's the perfect recipe for a monopoly. Very big upfront cost, very low and low marginal cost. And so basically that means that you're most efficient at large scale. If I'm Uber, my engineers have written the code for the platform and the access to using it. Okay. If I add 1 million users, yes, I have to have more servers, but the cost of that is peanuts comparing to the development. And so I can basically generate scale very easily. And I can do it fast on top of it. This wasn't possible before the digital technology. So we see all these firms that have an ability to create scale, to create basically large global markets, okay, without having to worry too much about entry, because they have these scale economies. And it's not just scale, it's also what we call network externalities. If I think of something like the platform that's eBay, okay, what this does is that if I'm a buyer on eBay, I really want this to be a large marketplace. I want there to be a lot of sellers. I want them to offer a lot of things and maybe even compete against each other. If I'm a seller, I want there to be a lot of buyers. So the larger the platform is, the more valuable. I don't want to be on a social network, Instagram, where there's not many people. I want it to be large. So network externalities are another reason why we basically want large scale. All of these are reasons why you basically create natural monopolies, and that's why these firms, they understand this perfectly well. They face very little competition. They've competed a lot for the market. They were very heavily competing to be the first ones, but once they created that market, there was very little competition because no one could get in. No one can compete to become the eBay or the Amazon or the Instagram. Okay, because you've created that enormous network advantage. So the question is, what is the underlying economic mechanism behind this? And we would really like to understand what this is. And I think having these technological this technological change which creates scale economies and network externalities, that tells us also something about what the underlying causes are. And I see three causes. One is lax antitrust enforcement. If you think about this, people have been arguing that the competition authorities has really been sitting on their hands for a few decades, haven't been very active in enforcing much of the mergers and acquisitions which created some of the market power. This is to do with what is called the Borg doctrine. Borg was a lawyer from Chicago and who basically had argued very forcefully and convinced a lot of people in the establishment that it's better in terms of antitrust not to enforce too much. There's no problem, and there wasn't much of a problem in 1980. So let the firms do what they're doing. We shouldn't really be very strict in terms of the antitrust enforcement. When we quantify the effects, this accounts for something like 15 or 20% of the rise in market power. It is there, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is the second one, which is fast technological change, what I mentioned earlier. This is this kind of advent of the digital technology, which has an enormous impact on the economy, but also not only in the positive side of the productivity, but also in terms of creating moats around these firms. And it's going in two different ways. The first way is that we really have these fixed costs that are so much bigger. We have this notion that we have basically scale economies in order to produce. And the second one is that there's much more differences in productivities between firms. If you think about an Amazon can deliver this at a much lower cost than any other firm can do it. And so Amazon is kind of distinctly more productive than its competitors. Why? Because they're the only ones who have the network and the kind of the production capability and delivery capability than any other competitor. And then the third kind of component, or the third cause, is globalization, which I think of as a special case of technological change, because it means that we can ship and produce things faster, and we can have information transmission much more efficient. Okay, and that's again due to the digital technology that allows you to, send information to China within less than a second, which before wasn't possible. And in the same way, we can ship these things, the goods, if we've produced them in China, back to the West in a few weeks. There's one kind of thing that I think is important that tells us really when we measure these productivity differences, is that it's really all about this inequality that I was telling you in terms of having more productive firms than others. What this graph shows you is again a distribution, the blue one in 97 and the red one in 2016, of what we have estimated what is the underlying productivity of firms. And what we see is that the red distribution looks more unequal, much more spread out. You say, oh, this is small differences. This is on a log scale. Okay, and given it's on a log scale, if I see a 1 difference going, say, from 15 to 16, that means it doubles the productivity. So that right tail, that red distribution, that's a little bit to the outside, it means that the top firms are, twice as productive now than they were in 1997. And this is indicating that there's really, a huge change in the productivity of firms that we've seen in recent years. A second kind of important aspect of the productivity of firms is financial friction. Smaller firms are more financially constrained. And what this does is that it's increasing the productivity gap. Why? Because the large firms, they sit on a lot of cash. Google never is constrained financially. They have a lot of cash. They don't need to borrow. If you're a startup and you start out, you need to go to the bank and you need to pay your engineers and your programmers every day or every month, okay? And you need to make ends meet at the end of the month, and you're not selling yet. So you need to borrow from the bank. Google, when they go in a new venture, they sit on so much cash that they generate, they don't need to do that. Again, well, this small startup is probably going to say, well, I would have liked to develop this part of my product, but I don't have the money to do it. I'm going to hire a few less engineers than I would have liked to if I could unconstrained develop it. And this is again leading to bigger differences in these productivities, and therefore the bigger these differences in productivity, the more market power there is. How costly is this? We calculate that this is around 8% of GDP. Okay, so basically if you think about this, this is huge. The cost of inflation, say 10% inflation, is estimated to be around 0.5%. There's an old paper by Lucas, the cost of inflation, 0.5% of GDP. If this is 8%, this is 16 times the cost of inflation. We talk about inflation all the time. We think that inflation is important. Well, this is even more important. This is even bigger. Where does this efficiency gain come from? Again, what I mentioned earlier. Yes, you have a lower price because you become more efficient. Think of Amazon. They really do deliver at a lower cost than anyone else. But the declining cost is more than the decline in price. So they don't pass on these gains to their customers. And that's why the price to cost ratio, this markup, is going up. So you see that the way we get this output loss, the way we get this inefficiency loss of 8% of GDP is coming from the fact that, yes, there's efficiency gains, but these are not passed on to the customers, and therefore this, what we call, leads to a deadweight loss. Okay, now what is it we can do about this? What is the type of policy intervention we can use to do something about it? We can use taxation. The good thing about taxation is that if there's enormous profits, okay, and say wages have stagnated, we can redistribute. So you have to tax less income and you can tax more profits. So that's a way of redistributing, but unfortunately it doesn't solve the problem. We can't get rid of the fact that these firms are monopolistic. In the ideal world in which we could tax all these firms, it's hard because these firms hide their profits in different tax havens, but even if we could do it, that wouldn't make them less of monopolists. They're still going to try and maximize their profits, which then would be taxed away. So the role of taxation is redistribution, but it doesn't solve the problem of this monopoly. So the only thing we can do is, of course, reduce market power. Now, how can we do it? Well, if we think about the current antitrust kind of policies and the regulation, this is really at the moment focusing on the harm to consumers and workers, but it has very limited ways of dealing with what we call these externalities from this economy-wide market power. So now we're going to ask, is there something else that we can do? Well, how can we get more competition? Well, one way to get more competition is to basically split up the firms. It's not clear that this is the right thing to do, because if the reason why these are monopolies are scale economies, or if the reason why these are monopolies are network externalities, then this is good. Again, I don't want my Instagram to be halved and therefore I can't have access to some of the other people. So scale is kind of the hero part of the technological effect in the economy. But if we don't want to split them up, there's something we can do. Maybe we want to keep the large scale, but we want to introduce some competition on the large scale. Think of the railway lines. It doesn't make sense to have two parallel railway lines to compete. But we can do something which is called in technology and now also in economics is called interoperability, which is you have one set of rails, but you let different firms compete on these same rails. So you separate the network and the scale part from the operational part. Interoperability is everywhere. I can send an email from my UPF account to your account in the University of Maastricht. These are different competing ISPs, as we call them, Internet Service Providers. But the regulation is that you have to be able to do it. I can make a phone call from a Spanish number to an American number. This is interoperability. This is regulation that said you have different networks that you have to give access to. Okay. Notice that this is not everywhere. Try and send a message from WhatsApp to Telegram. Impossible. You can send an email from one provider to another provider, but you can't send a text message from one provider to another one, from WhatsApp to Telegram. Okay? That's because there's no regulation that imposes this degree of interoperability. What interoperability does is it injects immediately competition. Right? Because I don't need to have that big network to be able to communicate with it. I can communicate across these networks. But that's only coming from regulation. Okay? And so basically we need to regulate these dominant firms the way we regulate utilities. What are utilities? Electricity providers, water providers. We know that these are natural monopolies, but really what we've done, and these companies, by the way, electricity, have been around for 100, 120 years. It took us a long time, but we're regulating them now ex ante, where we say, you know, if you want to operate in this market, you can't just do what you want. There is no free market there because you're a monopolist. So the regulator says what is allowed and what is not allowed. And interoperability is one of these things in which you manage to create competition. There's interoperability in the telecom market, for example, in the 90s that was introduced. In the telecom market in Europe, what you wanted to do as a telecom operator was have your own little network. The regulator came in and said, no, you can't do that. If you have a system or a network of cell towers, you have to let, and you're in the Netherlands, you have to let a Polish provider come on it. You don't want them to use it, but because that creates competition. But the regulator introduced this type of interoperability, and that creates competition. So you're using the advantage of this network, but at the same time, you allow that large network, you know, to be populated by competing providers, which gives you competition for your customers and lower prices. And that's exactly what you would like to do. The problem with this policy is that there's a vicious circle. You start with market power, okay, and that creates profits. What you do with these profits? One thing you can do with these profits is you go and lobby policymakers. If you lobby policymakers, what's the outcome? You get favorable regulation. You tell your policymakers, hold on, here's some money for your party, but don't introduce interoperability in my market. I don't like this because I'm going to have lower profits. And if you get favorable regulation, what's going to happen is that, well, you have more market power. And if you have more market power, you have more profits, more lobbying, more favorable regulation. So there is basically a kind of a vicious circle between the market power and the political power that are closely linked. And the amount of money that's circulating of these monopolistic firms is so large that they're really having a direct influence on the political process, which is supposed to regulate these outcomes. Okay. Let me say just one last thing about ownership of these firms. In a sense, we're all owners, possibly, of these firms. Because, for example, if you have a pension fund, you have some money that you've saved and you've invested in a stock market pension account, well, then you might have some shares in Apple. So then, you know, all of us who have a pension fund might be owners of these dominant firms. So it's not just, you know, Elon Musk and Zuckerberg, who are the people who own these big firms. They own the biggest chunk of it, but you know, everyone owns it. One of the things that we have to be careful about is, what if we start to now introduce competition? Well, if there's going to be introduced competition, we're going to see their profits decline, we're going to see the market valuation decline. my Dow Jones would be lower if there was more competition. That's going to have an effect on your pension fund. That's going to have an effect on Zuckerberg and Musk and Steve Jobs' relatives, but also on you. Okay. And the question is, you know, politically, this is going to be very difficult. We calculate that this effect is something like a 40% drop in the stock market valuation. Okay, so this is going to be politically very costly. Once you introduce this competition policy and you would have more competition, you see a drop in people's pension funds, and they're going to say, hold on, I didn't sign up for this. So the transition through the political process of introducing more competition and more pro-competitive policies is going to have an impact also on, you know, you and I who have a pension fund. Okay, this is my last slide, and what I want to say with this one is that basically the main driver of why we see this change in market power is fast technological change. It has economy-wide implications that we talked about in the labor market, in the dynamism of firms, and in inequality. It has large welfare costs that are around 8% of GDP, much higher than the cost of inflation, which we think is very important. Okay. There's one thing, if you think about it, digital technology is not new in being kind of a disruptor of the economy or in being a technological change that leads to market power. We also had this around 1900. Then it was, as I said, electricity, telegraph, railways. And what happened then was it created also these enormous large firms. You know, if you think about the Carnegies, the Mellons, if you think about the Rockefellers, they became rich. The JP Morgans, they became rich with, you know, the monopolies that they had created from these new technologies back then. So the new digital technology from the last 3-4 decades is not something that we see for the first time. Also then, it created these monopolies, and it took us a long time to get rid of it. How did we get rid of it? In the end, it was with 2 world wars and a great recession. I think we can do better, having learned from that experience. We have things like interoperability, we have regulation. It's just that we have to act a little bit faster, because we'll see the Dow Jones continues to increase. And why does it increase? Because there's a few firms that are so dominant, so profitable, that generate such a high market valuation because they are maintaining their dominant position and they're not being challenged. So I guess if you want to think about policies, we'd better act soon rather than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Eeckhout, for this very interesting and clear lecture. Let's quickly go to the questions, because we don't have that much time left, and I would like to give Professor Joan Muysken the chance to ask the first question, if you have one. I hope so.
Thank you very much for this inspiring and interesting lecture. I have 2 questions, if I'm allowed. One is about this interoperability. Does it really work? I mean, can you give examples? When I think of it, I know the telephone, that's a very good example, probably, which did work. But if you think about railways and the railway systems, we can all think about Britain, we can all think about France, we can all think about the Netherlands, for instance, probably Belgium too, if I may add that. That doesn't work at all. So why does telephone work, and why don't railways don't work, and how can we make them work? That would be my first question. I mean, it's probably very hard to really establish this interoperability. Maybe you could reflect on that a little bit. The other question is about productivity. And you mentioned the productivity slowdown in passing by. Well, we are both macroeconomists, and we know that there's a lot of discussion about the productivity slowdown. But your figure didn't show really the productivity slowdown, so that's my first implicit question already. Where the hell is this slowdown? But also, what you're telling us about all these things, isn't that the cause of the productivity slowdown, although you don't show it? So you don't show the productivity slowdown, but you explain it. So maybe that's the productivity slowdown paradox.
So, great questions. So let me start with the second one. the reason why it's not very visible is because it's such a long time series, and the productivity slowdown is only for the last 10, 15 years, and I had a series for, I think it was 70 years. Okay, you typically see the productivity, if you would look carefully, you would see it there. The second thing, which is more important, that I think we have to do much more work, is when we measure productivity, typically the way we measure it is by assuming competitive markets. And so productivity measurements depend on what your view is of how the world works in the economy. And I mean, I've done a little bit on that, but there's much more work to be done on that, which is that if you assume that markets are not competitive, the measured productivity, because productivity is just a residual of what comes out of that, will look different. And in, I don't know the result yet, but it may well depend very much on how we measure that productivity. That might include the fact that there's market power, and therefore we see actually higher increase in productivity, which in a sense, I don't think that with all these technological innovations is a way of saying, hold on, do we have lower productivity? I find it hard to believe, and so it is a puzzle. It's an open question. So two things: one, I think it is there, and two, maybe it's not rightly measured. Your first question, does interoperability work? I cannot agree more that it's a very hard problem. It's a hard problem for political reasons, because those who are benefiting from not having interoperability oppose it. You mentioned the telephone market. Interoperability is not there in the United States. We have 3 operators. In Europe, we have something like 100, 150 operators. The service in Europe is much better than the service in the United States, because they don't have to compete for any of their customers. Okay. So you pay in the United States about 2.5 times. My plan in the United States is 2.5 times higher than it is in Europe. Okay, for a, if anything, worse service. So that's an example where it works. I agree that in the railway market, if you want, it's not really working. We had the example of Railtrack in the United Kingdom, where it was set up in a very inefficient way. Accidents happened because they were not investing. I think there's a little bit of a kind of a silver lining. If you look at what happens, that the case I know best, the high-speed rail in Spain, they have, I think, designed quite well the interoperability. So now you have the Italians, the Germans, the French, and the Spanish competing on, say, Barcelona-Madrid. Prices have gone down dramatically. It's set up in a more clever way than what the UK did 15 or 20 years ago. Is it perfect? No. Is it going to work for the long run? We don't know. It's always going to be a hard problem how to do it. But I would say that there is hope that it can work. Interoperability is remarkably simple as a concept, but very hard to implement. But when it works, it has enormous implications. And the example of the telecom, I mean, if the price is 2.5 times higher without the interoperability, that's saying that something is really happening there.
Any more questions?
Okay. I remember that Keynes thought that in his future people would work very less, yes, because you have machines who make the production. So it's a little bit not comprehensible that the labor share is still much the same, about 2/3, as you said. Yes. So my question is, in fact, well, has these 2/3 to do with productivity of labor, or is it just a kind of distribution system of money and so on, buying capacity, which works quite well till the 80s, but later it worked less because it gets accustomed that people get money also from stocks.
So I mean, it is magic that the labor share has been constant in the 1980s. I don't think that the fact that people work more or less, as Keynes was suggesting, and we see it in the data, the number of hours has been declining for the last 150 years since we measured it, would have necessarily to change the labor share, because of course you decrease the numerator because you have fewer hours that you work, but you also decrease the denominator because you produce kind of less with that labor. I think that the reason why the labor share is constant is technological. To produce something, you need capital and labor. Okay. Now there could be a technological reason why the labor share declines. If I can do the same thing, okay, with less labor and I just use more capital, then I would have a decline in the labor share. But let's not fall into the Luddite trap. The Luddites were this movement in the second industrial revolution of people who said, you know, all these weaving machines, they're gonna destroy the labor because we're replacing workers with labor. Okay. The Luddite trap is that, yes, there are firms that substitute workers with machines, and there the labor share in that firm is going down. But of course we see this today too. AI or technological innovations are labor saving, but other firms happen too, are founded too. We see, for example, cleaning services are extremely high labor share firms. Okay, so if I look at a cleaning service, they might have a labor share of 80% because they don't have any machines. They just have the mop and some water. I mean, that's what they do. Okay, they have a lot of labor. And what has been happening over the last decades is that, yes, you know, companies have had labor being produced by capital, but then they were outsourcing their cleaning, they were outsourcing their restaurants and hospitality services. So we have to look at the entire distribution in the economy, and ultimately it's a technological question, what happens to the labor share. And we should, when I say we should not fall in the Luddite trap, because of course we can identify individual firms or even sectors where the labor share declines, but we're talking here about the labor share in the economy as a whole. And if the labor share in, say, Google is declining, but I see more outsourcing to cleaning services, then on average it's a wash. And that's been something that we've been seeing, but what has happened since 1980 is not, and now I'm entering into detail, when we estimate this distribution of these labor shares across firms, the average of the productivity hasn't changed, but because of the market power, the workers got a lower share of that pie, and that's why the labor share has declined, not because of the productivity that has changed.
I have a question about one of the graphs that you showed. There is one that I didn't understand. It has two colors, blue and red. Can you show that graph again? Because
of course, there's a few that have blue and red, so I'll go back and you tell me to stop.
With the y-axis on the logarithmic scale and the...
What was it, this one?
Yeah. What is on the x-axis?
This is the log of productivity.
On the x-axis?
Yes.
And on the y-axis?
No, this is x, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, this is the productivity of firms. So if you want e to the 20 is the productivity of the most productive firm. Okay? And then on the y-axis, it just says how many firms there are. It's a density. It's a distribution.
Okay. Then there was another graph where on the right side it started at 1.3.
Okay.
Yeah, that.
This one.
If you would choose the y-axis differently, would you have got the same conclusion?
Say that again.
At 1.3.
The only thing that this graph says is that these two series are increasing. That's the only thing that this graph is saying. Okay. So basically it says that in 1980, both manager pay starts to increase and markups start to increase. That's what this graph is saying. The two units and scales are different because one is in millions and one is in 1.2 to 1.9. Okay, if I would put it on the same scale, I would have something that's flat there, and that's why we do it.
Let's try to do 4 questions. I don't know if
there's someone in the back there.
Yeah, I saw a lot of hands. So first you and you.
I really enjoyed your talk. And your book seems quite interesting. And I was curious if you take into account the role of AI in the future. And if you do, like, can you give us like a glimpse of how you do that? Like the role of AI
yes.
In your book, like, can you give us a glimpse of how you take that into account for the future?
So, I mean, again, the book came out in 2001. I talk a little bit about AI. At the moment, at the macroeconomic level, I've seen a lot of studies on AI at particular firms, particular sectors, but at the macroeconomic level, I haven't seen much convincing yet. Okay, because we don't have the data yet. Okay, it's very hard to identify, the role of AI at a macroeconomic effect, because AI is big now, but we look at data, for the whole economy 1 or 2 years back. So we're looking at 2022 in the best case. And until 2022, AI wasn't probably big enough to have a macroeconomic effect. That said, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look for it and try. And I think AI is going to have a huge effect. Okay, we're going to see one of the things where I think AI is going to have the biggest effect, if I can get there quickly, is this one. Okay, what I think is going to happen is that, let me just make sure that this is going to go up, okay, substantially, for a very small group of people. That is, some people have argued that maybe what AI is going to do is going to collapse or kind of reduce the dispersion in its productivity, because what AI is going to do is going to basically introduce technological competition for the highest skilled workers. And I think some of that is going to be true, but what's going to happen is that if you're at the top of the distribution, you're going to be so much in demand that you become a superstar coder. And so now you're going to have this top 1 or top 0.1% of workers who are going to be off the charts. Okay, so AI is going to have this kind of seemingly contradictory effect, I think, of reducing the inequality, because AI, what machines and what robots did to substitute the low-skilled workers here, okay, is now going to do for the high-skilled workers, but some of them. Okay, and so some of them, and especially these, are going to suffer most. Okay, but there's going to be some of these workers who are now going to be so much in demand, because you have a way to, someone still is going to have to do something in terms of deciding what AI is going to do, and these are going to be the ones who are going to be off the charts. And I think that's going to be one of the implications that are going to be, I would be looking forward to see evidence on as soon as possible.
Thanks. Thanks for the interesting lecture. And in view of time, I will condense my question. If I understand you correctly, you say that technologies need to be mature, need to be regulated, so that everything, the profit paradox is under control, right? Now my question is, when the technologies are new, nobody knows those technologies, so you cannot, how can you regulate them? Isn't it an irony or paradox in itself?
Hey, this is a great point. The only thing we can say is that, when we start to see them, we should intervene as quickly as possible. Okay? Because we know, for example, let me give you the example of, this is now not exactly about technology, but the merger of Facebook with Instagram in 2013-14. Everyone said, yeah, one is images, the other one is text. Okay, it's clear that today they're competitors for the advertising market. Okay, and that they basically monopolize that market in the social network space completely. They have 85% of that market. Okay, but we knew by 2015 that this was an issue, and so we could have intervened then. There it's more about undoing mergers, but it's the same thing with technology. the moment we see that the technologies have an impact, of course you can't do it if you don't know what the technology is, but once the technology is out and is being sold and it's being used, well then again, you know, at the policy front, we need much faster interventions and being able to do something about it. Remember that Schumpeter said, the monopoly profits are the incentive to innovate. But if you give a firm 2 or 3 years ahead by having these monopoly profits, they're going to be very happy with that. What they get now is they get 20, 30 years with profits. So, you know, maybe you've lost 2 or 3 years in terms of the inefficiency from monopoly, but if you intervene quickly enough, then at least, you know, you can adjust that. And I think that's one of the things that's missing at the moment.
Thank you for your interesting lecture. I have a question on your solution. Your solution is about to break down the monopolies, or maybe also the monopolies. And you talked also about this vicious circle from lobbying from the monopolist. So my question would be indeed, do you have suggestions how to break down this vicious circle? How to break down the lobbying of these monopolies to the policymakers?
I mean, the answer is no, but what I would suggest is we should get rid of any lobbying. I mean, you can make it illegal. You can make party financing by private firms illegal. You know, I know that there's a lot of people who think, oh no, this is very good for the economy because the political process needs information and input from the firms. But I can see those arguments, but there's so many more negative effects that it's much better, I think, to completely rule them out. And then you're going to have a political campaign that you're going to have to finance with public money. You're going to have to say, you know, you want to do, you want to run advertising, you're going to have to get your money from, you know, your government-determined pocket money to run your campaign. You can't go to your big companies and say, give me some money, because these companies, they don't do that for free. They don't give you money just because they like you. They give you money because they get something in exchange. And, you know, if we realize that, then it's much better to use taxpayers' money for the campaign to finance firms. I know that I'm probably a little bit on the extreme in that one, but I see no other solution to do that.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this lecture. I was wondering something. So we were talking about that wages are stagnating, but the markups is increasing more and more. Do you think that there would be a point in which the prices of the products that these companies make will basically go above the average wage? So, you know, people will not be able to afford their products, so the companies cannot. Oh, closer. Oh, so the companies will not be able to actually sell their products. And if we reach this point, you know, will this be actually the moment in which firms will actually rethink the way they do business? Because, you know, just increasing the markup and pushing profits to the max is not, you know, the solution.
This is a very interesting question. Okay, I think this is a question that has a lot of distributional aspects to it, because ultimately everything that's being produced is going to be consumed. So I'm not worried about the fact that it's being produced, that it can't be consumed, or that's going to be used for capital. You know, it's not all consumption. It could be produced in order to make machines, so to speak. But I think underlying what you say is something about inequality. There's going to be a bunch of people who are going to have such low wages, if this were to continue, that they can't afford to buy much. Okay. Now the rich can afford to buy whatever they want because they're rich, and there's going to be a lot of Lamborghinis and Ferraris that are going to be produced, and yachts and you know, villas in I don't know what kind of places. So it's more about how is the distribution of consumption going to change. If we continue like that, we're going to see more and more people who are going to be, you know, consuming very little. Okay, and their consumption stagnates in a sense, and guess what? People are going to be discontent. And I don't want to claim that the type of polarization that we see today is all because of the economics, but I think that the economics is kind of at least one of the contributors to it. If people go and say they vote for Brexit and they say, you know, maybe we do or we don't, but we think it's not good for us, but let's still vote for it because we're fed up. Okay, because they got the short straw in, you know, what the economy offers them, because they get such a low wage that they don't even care anymore. And if people go to, you know, to populist politicians and say, yeah, you offer us at least something that we think will help us because the economy is not offering us something, I think that type of polarization is exactly what the problem is. In the aggregate, I'm not worried. We're going to have a lot of luxury cars and yachts, okay? But I'm worried about the distribution, and that's exactly the type of danger that I think we'll see.
Okay, we are running out of time, so let's do one more question and you can ask the question.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, it's very interesting. I wanted to discuss this issue from the perspective of globalization. And is it true, this wage inequality in general, for all of the countries, not only for America, because I think most of the big companies are like settled in America and Silicon Valley? It's one question. And second one, if we discuss this issue, we have, you already mentioned Schumpeterian, and we have this technology transfer, and we have this catching up of technology and innovation all over the world. So I think it's a good thing to have innovation and to have this technology as long as we share, and these technologies are applied in other countries. So why do we have to penalize them for inventing something new?
I mean, again, we don't want to penalize them for inventing them. I mean, that's the hero part of the... we want to try and that they sell their inventions at a more competitive price. Okay, they've invented products, which is great. They've invented services, which is great. But they've also been able to use that new technology to create moats. Okay, and I think the whole point of the regulation is to reduce the moats, not to reduce the inventions. Okay, you might lose some of the inventions because, you know, now they're doing it because these moats are so big. But in a Schumpeterian, remember Schumpeter, one of the things he said is that you need monopoly, but it's a temporary monopoly. The fact that Google has been around for 30, 35 years, that's no longer temporary. Okay, if you see how much of profits that they make, okay, this is no longer compensating the investment they made in the 90s. That investment has been paid off a million times. Okay, so the Schumpeterian idea is completely satisfied. What they've done now is they've cemented, okay, that position, which is with the moat. The second thing the first question you mentioned, is this true in other places? Well, the inequality, for example, in some European countries is much less than in the US because we do much more redistribution. France is the key example. Inequality in France hasn't gone up. But remember that what matters here at the firm level is what is the total labor cost. Okay? Because where does the redistribution come from? Through taxes that you pay on your income. And so when we look at our surveys, we see people's after-tax income, but also the contributions that the firms make before the taxes, so the employer contributions. And France has enormous redistribution like that. There's work that says, let's calculate the total labor cost for the firm, and that total labor cost inequality has gone up as much as in the US in France. Okay? Now, you know, at the household level, there's much more equality because there's so much more redistribution. Okay, so let's be careful what we measure there. And then there's a third point that's you kind of touched upon, and I'm not sure exactly whether that's a question, but let me mention it. You said these firms are in Silicon Valley, okay, and that's true, but these firms are global firms. So what does it why do we care that this firm is an American firm if it sells around the world? What really matters is where the customer is. And the customer is everywhere. The fact that we have in Silicon Valley, okay, a firm that is extremely successful, if you go to California, you drive, you know, to the east of California, there's no tech there. There's no tech in Alabama. There's no tech in maybe some of the European countries. But that's not what matters. It matters where is the customer. Okay, and all the customers in Alabama, in Eastern California, and in Europe are using these monopolistic products. Okay, ultimately, I can buy shares in Apple, I can buy shares in Google, I can be an owner. I don't have to live in California to be an owner of these firms. So I can get those profits. And in fact, I do indirectly because I have a pension fund. Okay, I don't choose which companies to buy because it's a diversified fund, but it's very likely that I have some of these firms. Okay, so I'm already an owner of those firms. The fact that their mailing address is in Mountain View or that their mailing address is in Silicon Valley is really irrelevant. Okay, because from an economic point of view, what we care about is where the customer is and where the worker is who produces the goods. And these are global firms. Okay. By the way, we also have Dutch firms. Booking.com, you know, it's a Dutch firm. ESML is a Dutch firm, not so far from here, that are also monopolies. Okay, we have them here too. It's everywhere. In Belgium, we have AB InBev, okay, a monopoly firm. It's a high markup firm. The fact that the mailing address of AB InBev is in Leuven is just a historical coincidence, because their market is global. And it's the customer, when you ask for a beer, whether it's in Shanghai, in Buenos Aires, or in St. Louis, you pay too much for your beer. And that's what matters, not the mailing address of the company. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk and very nice ending. I wanted to give you this as a token of appreciation, and also to thank you for for coming here and giving us this great evening. It's a small painting of Maastricht, so that you remember that you can take it with you in your luggage, and you will remember maybe this evening as well.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I open it?